All right, so the passage today is the second chorus from Jean Anouilh's existentialist version adaptation of Antigone. The spring is wound up tight. So very simple sentence that introduces this analogy, this metaphor, which will become an extended metaphor. It will uncoil of itself. That is what's so convenient about tragedy. So essentially, tragedy, the subject of this monologue, is introduced in the third sentence. The least little turn of the wrist will do the job. We're back to the extended analogy. The least little turn of the wrist will do the job. That does suggest some agency or some free will in that idea, the idea that it's you who is turning the wrist. Anything will set it going. A glance at a girl who happens to be lifting her arm to her hair as you go by, a feeling when you wake up on a fine morning that you'd like a little respect paid to you today, as if it were as easy to order as the second cup of coffee. One question too many. So what we have here is a list following this semicolon. Anything will set it going. We have the turn of the wrist, and then we have these three things here. A glance at a girl, a feeling when you wake up on a fine morning that you'd like a little respect, and finally, one question too many, idly thrown out over a friendly drink, and the tragedy is on. So I think here we have a kind of exemplification. Anything will set it going, and we have three possibilities, three very concrete images, any of which will do. This serves to triangulate what the speaker is saying here, right? Any of these three things. It could be as small as a glance at a girl who happens to be lifting her arms to her hair as you go by, or a feeling, a glance, a feeling, or a question. What's interesting is in this second one, a feeling when you wake up on a fine morning that you'd like a little respect paid to you today, as if it were as easy to order as a second cup of coffee. So here we have the speaker actually breaking after the comma and commenting on this second one, the feeling that you'd like a little respect to pay to you today. I mean, we presume that people are due respect, right? So it's sort of troubling that this simple feeling that you'd like a little respect paid to you today. Here, when that's not there, it's obviously not as easy to order as a second cup of coffee. One question too many, idly thrown out over a friendly drink, and the tragedy is on. So we have the spring is wound up tight. The least little turn of the wrist will do. Anything will set it going. The spring is wound up tight. Anything will set it going, and the tragedy is on. So we have metaphor and imagery here. We have abstraction and very concrete imagery, which is something we'll see as the monologue progresses. The rest is automatic. The spring is wound up tight. We have that very simple sentence at the beginning of the first paragraph. The rest is automatic. You don't need to lift a finger. I think here this you, the second person pronoun that's introduced at this point is quite interesting, because the you is that referring to me as an audience member? Remember, this is a chorus who's addressing the audience directly, or is it referring to the tragic hero or the tragic figure that we see on the stage? You don't need to lift a finger. So earlier it was the least turn of the wrist, but now you don't need to lift a finger because it's automatic. There's a tension there, there's an opposition there, there's a dialectic, thesis and antithesis. The machine is in perfect order. It has been oiled, so we're back to a metaphor. The machine is in perfect order. It has been oiled since time began. Here, I think, maybe our first indication of fate, that opposition to free will that was introduced in the first stanza, and it runs without friction. So we have the image of the machine running perfectly. Death, treason, and sorrow are on the march, and they move in the wake of storm of tears of stillness. This sentence requires me to read it several times, I think, because we start with three subjects, death, treason, and sorrow, and they move in the wake of storm of tears of stillness. So we begin the sentence with a list of three nouns, subjects, and we end with three things as well. Personification here, obviously, death can't be on the march, treason can't be on the march, sorrow can't be on the march. But I think if we think of them together, death, treason, and sorrow on the march, we imagine these sort of personified abstractions actually marching. They move in the wake of storm, of tears of stillness. So we begin in storm, which is the opposite of stillness, right? With tears in the middle. Every kind of stillness, again, a very beautiful, small little, it's actually a sentence fragment. It's not even a complete sentence. The hush when the executioner's axe goes up at the end of the last act. So hush takes us back to stillness. Now we've moved on to a new metaphor, from the machine to the executioner's act. This image here, this metaphorical image of the executioner's act, executioner's axe and act. Sorry, we have to mention that sound patterning and alliteration that we have there in axe and act. But the hush when the executioner's axe goes up at the end of the last act, it's not actually the axe that goes up at the end of the last act, it's the curtain, right? So that image kind of does double duty there. The unbreathable silence when, so we're still at hush, stillness, hush, silence, the unbreathable silence when at the beginning of the play, so we had the last act, now we have the beginning of the play, the two lovers, their hearts bared, their bodies naked, stand for the first time face to face in the darkened room, afraid to stir. So now we're from the abstractions of personification and metaphor, we're back to a very concrete image. The silence inside you. Silence again, we've seen that motif developed in this paragraph. Inside you, and now we're back to that second person pronoun. Are we talking about the audience? Are we talking about the tragic figure? When the roaring crowd, opposition between silence and roaring crowd, acclaims the winner. Now the audience of the theater, something which evokes highbrow, high art, is reduced to a kind of crowd in a Roman amphitheater, so that you think of a film without a soundtrack. We have to mention the anachronism here. If we're thinking about Antigone and Sophocles' sense, obviously they didn't have films. I guess for Anouilh it makes sense. So that you think of a film without a soundtrack. It's a very apt image because we're talking about a play, which is similar to a film, and we're talking about silence, which is similar to the soundtrack. Mouths agape and no sound coming out of them. The mouths agape and no sound coming out of them is, in this case, I think the actors on the film with no soundtrack. But also, we had a second ago the roaring crowd. Now we have just in the following line in the same sentence, mouths agape and no sound coming out of them. A clamor that is no more than a picture. Clamor is noise. It's the opposite of silence, but it's no more than a picture. It's almost like a synesthesia here, what we hear and what we see. And you, the victor, already vanquished. Kind of oxymoron with victor and vanquished. Obviously the alliteration there as well. You won, but you're vanquished for some reason, alone in your desert of silence. So a new metaphor introduced, but still developing that motif of silence. That is tragedy. So what is tragedy? Tragedy is the spring, tragedy is the machine, tragedy is the axe, tragedy is the sound and the silence. So these first paragraphs are kind of exemplification, using abstractions and concrete images. Tragedy is clean, it is restful, it is flawless. Now, as opposed to exemplifying through image and metaphor, we have a simple assertion. Tragedy is this, clean, restful, flawless. It has nothing to do with melodrama, and the distinction is established really midway through this passage. It has nothing to do with melodrama. Wicked villains, persecuted maidens, avengers, sudden revelations, and 11th hour repentances. Here we're talking about a form of story, melodrama, which is more plot-driven. Death in a melodrama, we saw death personified above in tragedy. Death in a melodrama is really horrible because it is never inevitable, which suggests that, of course, in tragedy, death is inevitable. The dear old father might so easily have been saved. The honest young man might so easily have brought in the police 5 minutes earlier. A list of two things, kind of images, scenarios, situations that are more at home or more at place in melodrama than in tragedy. In tragedy here, according to the speaker, the chorus, there's not going to be a fix. There will be no saving, right? It's inevitable, as it says before. In a tragedy, nothing is in doubt and everyone's destiny is known. I like the elegance of these simple sentences at the beginning, for as literary and as self-consciously literary as this passage is, the spring is wound tight, the rest is automatic. Tragedy is clean, restful, and flawless. In a tragedy, nothing is in doubt and everyone's destiny is known. This is very simple language that a child could understand. That makes for tranquility. So tranquility is a surprising idea given that personified list that we had earlier of, what was it, death, treason, and sorrow. Now we have tranquility. There's a sort of fellow feeling, the alliteration, among characters in a tragedy. This feels particularly apt given the story of Antigone. Creon and Antigone seem more alike than separate in a way, even though they're sort of on opposite sides of the table, on opposite sides of the coin. But they're both equally unbending, aren't they? There's a sort of fellow feeling among characters in a tragedy. He who kills is as innocent as he who gets killed. Very nice. Almost have a chiasmus here with the kills beginning the sentence, or the clause and ending as well, right? He who kills is as innocent as he gets killed, and between these two kills is innocence. It's all a matter of what part you are playing. A very existentialist idea there. And we have the you, so are we talking to us as an audience? No, I think most directly and primarily we're talking about the characters, right? But this second person pronoun suggests that we, the audience members, are in fact in the same situation. That for us, it's also a matter of what part we are playing. And as an audience member, we are playing a part. Tragedy is restful. So we're back to this simple formula. Tragedy is clean, it is restful, it is flawless. Tragedy is restful, and the reason is that hope, that foul, deceitful thing, has no part in it. So again, we have hope introduced, and then qualified, that foul, deceitful thing. Normally when we think of hope, we don't think of it as foul or deceitful. In fact, hope has quite positive connotations. Tragedy is restful, and the reason is that hope, that foul, deceitful thing, has no part in it. So now we have a reason provided for the reason that it's restful, the reason that we have this tranquility up here, because there is no hope. There isn't any hope. He comes out and says it. You are trapped. Again, the you, of course, firstly must be Antigone and Creon. There's some surprise there, right? Because Creon has so much power, and yet he's trapped by this situation that he's put in by Antigone, by his own decisions, by the people, by the impossibility of ruling. We're not sure, but then also us, right? You're trapped in a sense, like we're implicated in this as an audience member. The whole sky has fallen on you, and all you can do about it is shout. So that image is striking. Don't mistake me. I said shout. I did not say groan, whimper, complain. That you cannot do, but you can shout aloud. You can get at all those things said that you never dared say or never even knew until then. So it's surprising, right? You can shout, but you can't groan or whisper or complain. You can shout aloud. This idea of all those things said that you never dared say or never even knew until then. So tragedy then must be instructive. Tragedy teaches us things. Tragedy opens doors and possibilities that we hadn't considered, and somehow leads us to insights, things that had never been said before, but also were not known until then. And you don't say these things because it will do any good to say them. You know better than that. You say them for their own sake. You say them because you learn a lot from them. I think there's an irony there. If death is on the march and treason is on the march and everything is inevitable and you're going to die, then what is the point of learning a lot? You say them because you learn a lot from them. Obviously, in the ancient Greek sense of tragedy, tragedy is meant for us. It's meant for the audience. We experience that feeling of catharsis by seeing the tragic hero go through what she or he will go through, that feeling of pity, that feeling of fear that ultimately cleanses us. So we learn a lot, but it's strange because we're not the ones shouting, right? Here, this use of the you kind of obfuscates who are we talking about, when are we talking about the audience, and when are we talking about the character. If the course is suggesting that it's the character who learns, certainly that's ironic, because what's the point of learning when what does he say? The spring is wound tight and it will uncoil of itself. What's the point of learning with that in the face of that kind of inevitability? Of course, in the end, Creon does learn, and it is just a second too late. And there's a Greek word for that as well, but I can't pronounce it. I can only write it. In melodrama, you argue and struggle in the hope of escape. So we're back to that distinction, right? You argue and struggle in the hope of escape. Of course, in Antigone and Anouilh's, as well as Sophocles' version, there is an argument, a kind of thesis, antithesis between Creon and Antigone. We're back to this idea of hope. That is vulgar. It's practical. Now I find that fascinating because, again, if we're thinking earlier, we had these sort of suggestions, connotations of high art, something very high-minded, and here we're saying that the course is saying that hope is in fact vulgar, the opposite of high-minded and high art, because it's practical. Again, practical is something we would think of as having quite positive connotations, but in tragedy, seems like that should be like that, doesn't it? But in tragedy, where there is no temptation to try to escape, argument is gratuitous. It's kingly. Now, this is interesting because gratuitous, that's a word that collocates, that usually goes with violence. This is maybe the most common kind of pairing that I see, gratuitous violence, which would be like, you could argue that Game of Thrones has gratuitous violence, meaning like, okay, it's a lot of violence and it's not really necessary. It's unnecessary, it's superfluous. Argument is gratuitous in tragedy. Argument is gratuitous because the tragedy is inevitable. What makes argument gratuitous? Although it is fair that a play versus, say, Game of Thrones, something like that, which I think Anouilh's course would put into the category of melodrama, a play certainly is built on words and argument in a way that Game of Thrones maybe is not. But in tragedy, where there is no temptation to try to escape, argument is gratuitous. I like temptation to try to escape. Why would it be a temptation? Certainly you would want to escape if you're facing death. That wouldn't seem a temptation. That's almost a biological imperative, right? Argument is gratuitous. Not violence is gratuitous, but argument is gratuitous. It's kingly. Now, I actually had to look this up because I was like, what are you talking about? It's kingly. Associated with or typical of a king. His kingly duties. Kingly, again, should belong in that high-minded thing, I would think, right? It's kingly, but in this case, it's not the suggestion that the king doesn't matter. It's kingly, meaning it doesn't impact anything really. It's quite fascinating. So in this passage, that really depends upon metaphor, extended metaphors and analogies, and these very concrete images. That sort of exemplify the speaker's point about what tragedy is and what tragedy does. We have personification, and we have this distinction ultimately drawn between tragedy and melodrama, two, according to the course, very different kinds of storytelling. In each case, we have five quite neat little paragraphs here, each time introduced in a way that is in the simple sentence of a child. The spring is wound tight, the rest is automatic. Tragedy is clean, restful, and flawless. In a tragedy, nothing is in doubt, and everyone's destiny is known. In melodrama, you argue and struggle in the hope of escape. That very simplicity contrasted to some of the very self-consciously literary diction, imagery, and figurative language really makes this piece effective and memorable in the context of the play.